I want to tell you a story that was told to me by my Uncle Lenny, who actually lived in Warminster for most of his life. And it was told to him by his father, my grandfather. This would have been sometime in the late 1920s, not long before the Great Famine in Ukraine and Belarus. Now, I can't stress to you enough how the famine changed everything. It was devastating for my family and so many others. But on this night, before the famine, some young men from my grandfather's village, Rudnylevsk, had walked to another village for a dance. It would have been held in either a barn or a large house. And my uncle used to say that this was a common way for young people to blow off steam in the countryside, to get together and have fun. You can imagine the birch trees rustling in the moonlight as they walked there, the jugs of Horilka they carried to share, the raucous greetings at the threshold, the happiness, the hand-embroidered tapestries on the walls in the lantern light, the young people dancing over the creaking wooden floorboards as a few friends played balalaika or accordion in the corner, and yes, the Horilka and the vodka poured generously, toast after toast, in the old tradition. And on that night, perhaps, there were too many toasts, because for whatever reason, there was a brawl between the young men of our village and the young men of theirs. When the dust had cleared, the young men from our village walked home in the dark, imagined their clothes disheveled, their noses bloodied, and they went to bed. And the next morning, my Uncle Lenny said, the next morning, the elders of our village formed a delegation. Now, English was not Lenny's first language, but that was the word he used, a delegation. And they went to the other town to apologize for the conduct of their youth. Their youth had been poor guests. They had dishonored the whole village. The elders brought gifts with them for the parents of the other young men. Again, this was before the Great Famine, so they would have been able to bring baskets of food, baked goods. I heard this story many times. Once I asked Uncle Lenny, well, didn't they make their kids apologize? What? No, I don't know. Who cares? He said. Another time I asked, well, who won the fight? I guess we probably won the fight since we had to apologize, right? And my uncle looked at me as if I were speaking some third language that he didn't understand, but surely my question would have been a foolish one in that language also. Neither of these questions was relevant to the story as he understood it. Now, I've been fascinated with this story for years, in part because, as a Unitarian Universalist, I feel like I'm part of a village. My home church in Philadelphia, Restoration, which you probably know, that's first and foremost my village. But also Unitarian Universalism, the village as a whole. And it might be splitting hairs, but I also feel like I'm part of the village of Unitarian Universalists, the people I surround myself with, and I am one of, I guess. I've thought a lot about what our villages, hold to be honorable conduct, and how you can tell, and under what circumstances we would have to send a delegation to another village, and what we owe, each of us, the village, in terms of honor and good behavior, and under what circumstances I might think someone had dishonored the village. It's a really interesting question, at least to me. When I was younger, I came to church once with a mohawk, and no one made me feel a bit less welcome at Restoration. No one said, that's unacceptable here, so apparently it was acceptable there. And that says something about what falls under the umbrella of honorable conduct. I can imagine at another church, perhaps, that there might be things that are shameful that aren't to us. Imagine perhaps getting arrested while carrying the church banner. I can imagine at some churches that would not be considered honorable. Well, for a lot of Unitarian Universalists, getting arrested at a protest on behalf of the church is a huge badge of honor. To complicate things, just a little bit though, I've also heard criticisms of some things we hold honorable. For instance, It might not, in fact, be such an honor to get arrested. It might be a kind of privilege to be able to get arrested and assume that you'll be back out in a couple days and not have your life ruined. I've heard that also. So the issue of honor is pretty complex, but it's also largely invisible until it isn't. If you think that you don't have a church-related sense of honor, imagine for a second. Imagine that you drove to church with a friend, and just as you were pulling into the parking lot at Bucksmont, they casually rolled down their window and threw their coffee cup out onto the church lawn. And then they got out and went inside, as if nothing had happened. Now imagine that you got out of the car and a bunch of your friends from church were standing around outside, staring at you. Would you go pick up the cup, even though you hadn't been the one to throw it? Maybe you do have a sense of honor around what is okay at church and what is your responsibility. Now, to save you the suspense, I'm not going to give you a unified theory of Unitarian Universalist honor, and I'm definitely not going to tell you whether or not you've disgraced the church. Instead, it's my hope to just get you wondering. Because I think we do hold the whole village to a kind of standard of conduct, even when we don't talk about it. And that standard can be for better or for worse. Sometimes it serves us, sometimes it doesn't. And in fact, most of our standards of honor and honorable conduct, I would say, are not written down. Covenants, for example, are not supposed to be exhaustive lists of what to do and not to do. Can you imagine? Can you imagine putting into writing the fact that you're not supposed to eat the last Klondike bar in the church freezer without buying a new package? It's pretty petty to write something like that down, but at Restoration, everybody knew. So yes, my goal is to get you wondering about what the code of honor is, what it is for you in your heart. Let's get back to the story for a minute. Over the years, I have gotten a lot of old family stories wrong in sermons, only to have my dear old dad, who was watching via live stream, send me an instant message before the service was even over, setting the record straight that no, our family didn't eat tree bark during the Great Famine, they ate moss. Very different. And with my uncle now gone, I thought I should probably corroborate a few things, so I called Dad to consult on this sermon. I ran it by him. "I don't know that story," he said. "Really?" I asked. It seemed really important to Uncle Lenny. He told this story to me so many times. I asked if the story was plausible, the story about the brawl and the delegation and the gifts and the apology. "Well, sure," Dad said. "Yeah, that's plausible. He just didn't remember it." So why had one brother seized upon this story from almost a century ago as being the foundation of our family's honor, while the other brother had either not heard it, not listened, or just set it aside? Indigenous author Thomas King writes that the truth about stories is that that's all we are. All we are is our stories. My father explained that his family had had an extremely strong sense of honor and what was honorable that he might not share. Uncle Lenny had been a very inflexible person, though. One might say stubborn. And he carried an unflinching understanding from the old country that you do not disgrace yourself or your family or the village. I think in his lifetime, it probably brought him as much conflict and difficulty as it did strength and guidance. But the stories we tell, the stories that help us understand who we are and what matter to us, for better or worse, are all that we are. What are the stories that you tell about yourself and your family? What are the stories you tell about your church, about our faith? I asked my dad, "Do you share your family's sense of honor, any of it?" And he said yes and no. There are aspects he did, aspects he didn't. Well, that seemed cryptic, so I pressed further. And he explained. He explained that there had been times when each of his children could be said to have dishonored the family somehow. And I chose, he said, I chose not to make an issue of my children's dishonor. He said this with a smile, and I did not press further because I knew better. Honor, he said, honor is not something you can have forced upon you. You either understand it or you do not. You either practice it or you do not, and you live with the consequences. When has your sense of honor had to be flexible? When have you chosen to be flexible with your sense of honor? When have you made exceptions? And for whom? Was it for someone you loved? Why? When has your sense of honor had to be updated? After my uncle died, we held a memorial at the home of one of my cousins. The whole family brought the foods he loved, and we told all the old stories. It was the first time I met some of his friends from high school, all of them now also in their 80s, and Russian and Ukrainian immigrants. I asked his friend Oleg what he was like when he was a young man, perhaps before he became so set in his ways. Oh, the life of the party, Oleg said. He played music and sang. He could drink anyone under the table. And he was a European-style friend, Oleg said. What do you mean? I asked. In America, Oleg explained. In America, everyone is your friend, and you're friends with everybody. In the old country, we had maybe 3 friends, tops, but they were real friends. American friends, he said, when you tell them that you're putting a new roof on the house next weekend, they'll say good luck, and they'll mean it. But a European-style friend, when you tell them you're putting the new roof on, they'll ask what time they should arrive, and should they bring their own tools. Lenny was a European-style friend, he said. He was honorable. Now, you may or may not agree with that dichotomy. I'm not sure that I do. But I think there is something to be said about having a rigid set of societal expectations around what you're supposed to do as a matter of honor. I think it might come down to a matter of survival sometimes. After that conversation, I had a long talk with myself about what kind of friend I was and what kind of friend I wanted to be, and for that matter, what kind of church member I was. I began putting more attention into my friendships with people who might not be the life of the party, but by God, they showed up to help me move. And I began making less excuses when they had to move. It seems to me that our sense of honor and our sense of responsibility are intertwined together. And it doesn't matter if we derive them from our family, from our church, or from somewhere else. I have a friend who, at 35 years old, is an Eagle Scout and is still very involved in scouting. And despite being American, he is the quintessential European-style friend. Any thankless drudgery you can think of, he's there. Either cutting down a tree in your backyard and helping haul away the wood on a Saturday, or helping your middle schooler with math, or helping find you a bed at rehab. He'll be there. I asked him recently, what's that thing that you say, a scout is always helpful? No, he said, a scout is helpful. And he explained that he says that as a kind of deflection, that he recognizes why people give praise for doing the right thing, but that it makes him uncomfortable, as if he could have done otherwise. And so he simply responds, as a way of explanation, a scout is helpful. For another thing, he says it's less judgmental. I asked him about the role that scouting played in helping him develop that sense of honor, and what is the honorable thing to do. He said, scouting is his church, that he hasn't experienced a strong sense of the divine. Now here, I did not explain that that's not a prerequisite for being a Unitarian Universalist, but I digress. He said he hasn't experienced a strong sense of the divine, but that scouting gave him a strong ethical foundation and the guidelines of right behavior. One of his pet peeves, he says, is when people say, I can't come over this weekend, I have to do something else. No, he says, you could come over, you chose to do something else. And that's okay, say so. I thought back to my conversation with Oleg about European-style friends. My Eagle Scout friend says, don't get him wrong. He's okay with people not always choosing to come help. After all, a scout is not always helpful, they're just helpful. We all have a lot of demands on our time. What he's not okay with is pretending that it's not a decision we make that informs who we are. If he wants to go to the beach instead of helping you move, he'll just say so and own it. I'm a scout, he told me. It's not uncommon that we'll do a barn raising and 7 or 8 of us will come help you move. But when you work at a scout camp, he said, you spend an obscene amount of time with these people in an environment where moral inculcation is always present. And unlike the church of his upbringing, he said, he winds up seeing the results of that system of ethics. The barn gets raised here and now, or it doesn't. And you see that outcome. You do or you do not, you practice it or you do not, and you live with the consequences. Unitarian Universalists work pretty hard to bring about the kingdom of heaven here on earth, here and now, for that and other reasons. Of course, saying by way of explanation, well, a Unitarian Universalist affirms the inherent worth and dignity of all people and strives to uphold the democratic process, is not as succinct as a scout is helpful. But I'm willing to bet that your understanding of what constitutes honor and honorable conduct has shaped the church, just as being a part of this church has surely shaped your understanding. This coming week, you might pay attention to when you act upon honor and what the consequences are. I'd like to close with one last story. Can I tell the Jimi Hendrix story? I asked my dad. As long as you don't mess it up, he said. And here it is. On February 21st and 22nd, 1968, Jimi Hendrix played live at the Electric Factory in Philadelphia. I wonder if some of you were at that very show. My father was not. Then, 19 years old, he had to spend that whole weekend re-roofing the chicken coop on their farm in Atco, New Jersey. The coop was 300 feet long and 40 feet wide, covered with rolls of heavy tar paper that had to be pulled up and replaced periodically. And to the Ukrainian immigrant parents of 1968, choosing this Hendrix person over the farm would have been unimaginable, unless he were a family member, but then, presumably, he would have put down the guitar and helped with the coop. It wasn't punishment, my father told me. I was the help, and it needed done. And I couldn't say I've got better things to do. He said he silently grumbled through the entire weekend, but really grumbled. Meanwhile, people he knew went to the concert. But they wound up stuck outside. They couldn't get in. They wound up sort of hearing it at best from the sidewalk. Considering that you might not have even gotten in, I asked, are you glad you stayed and helped your dad? Yes, he said. Yes. He remembers that late one day, when they were finishing up, it was getting to be dusk, he said. And he remembers sitting on the roof and looking around. Not just at the farm, but at everything, he said. And there was a feeling of payback. I'm not sure what the payback was, he said, but it felt like a peacefulness settled on me. That everything was right with the world. Honor is not something that can be forced upon you, but something that grows within you with every story you tell and every story you make by living. And when the stories you have inside of you line up with the way you understand honor and the way you live, it just feels right. Sometimes it serves us better than others. But I can say that I'm grateful that on a cold morning around 1928, some elders from our village wrote a story for us. They went to apologize, rather than figure out who was right. Bound by honor, they showed up to make amends and repair relationships with the people of the next village who would help them thresh their wheat or bring in their hay or re-roof the coop. The people who would host other dances and other festivals in the years to come. The people who would help in times of crisis. And when the famine came, we lived. Amen. Blessed be.